The meeting between US President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House in February 2025 was a diplomatic discussion that attracted significant attention from the international community, not only due to the importance of the foreign policy issues between the two countries, but also because of the tension that this meeting generated. In particular, the strong criticism from US Vice President JD Vance towards President Zelensky sparked considerable debate and led to a disappointing outcome compared to initial expectations. This meeting did not achieve the specific results expected. Negotiations on minerals, one of the critical issues, were unsuccessful, and even the joint press conference between the two leaders was cancelled after heated arguments. In the context of the increasingly tense political and military situation in Ukraine, the events of this meeting may have a far-reaching impact on the relationship between the US and Ukraine, as well as influence US foreign policy in the future. Vice President JD Vance played a crucial role in the meeting between US President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in February 2025, not only in expressing a strong political stance, but also in shaping US foreign policy decisions amid the ongoing Ukraine-Russia conflict. JD Vance, a prominent Republican politician and a staunch supporter of the America First policy, made it clear that the US could not continue to provide unconditional aid to Ukraine without concrete commitments from Kyiv regarding the pursuit of a peaceful resolution. Vance's viewpoint was not just a reflection of his own views, but also the voice of a significant portion of the Republican Party who believe that the US needs to reduce its involvement in international conflicts and focus on its national interests. Vance did not hesitate to criticize President Zelensky for his lack of gratitude towards the aid the US has provided to Ukraine throughout the war against Russia. During the meeting, he expressed his disappointment that Ukraine had not taken practical steps to advance peace negotiations with Russia, something Vance viewed as essential to end the prolonged war and ease the financial burden on the US. This criticism became sharper when Vance asserted that the US could not continue to be an endless bank for other nations, particularly when Ukraine had no clear commitments to peace and no indication that the war would end in a way that benefits both sides. To better understand Vance's role in this meeting, we need to consider the political context and US foreign strategy under Trump's leadership. America First is a principle shared by both Vance and Trump, promoting a reduction in US involvement in international issues, particularly conflicts that do not have direct benefits for the US. This is why Vance did not hesitate to criticize Zelensky, stressing that Ukraine needed to become more self-reliant and find ways to resolve the war without continuous US support. Vance reminded Zelensky that without a negotiation strategy with Russia, US aid could not continue indefinitely, while President Trump seemed to maintain a more conciliatory and flexible attitude during the meeting. Vance expressed a hardline stance, placing US national interests first. This attitude is not new in Vance's politics. He has repeatedly emphasized that the US needs to focus on solving domestic issues rather than intervening in international conflicts without clear benefits. Vance's criticism of Zelensky clearly reflected this viewpoint, as he believed the US had grown weary of supporting other countries without seeing clear and long-term results. Specifically, Vance asserted that Ukraine could not expect the US to continue funding without a significant change in their approach, especially in negotiations with Russia. However, one notable aspect is that Vance did not simply criticize, but also offered suggestions for change. He urged Ukraine to have a clear plan for negotiations with Russia and encouraged Zelensky not to rely solely on U.S. aid, but to take a proactive role in seeking a peaceful resolution. This perspective from Vance was not an unreasonable criticism, but rather a proposal for a strategic shift, aiming to help Ukraine become more self-reliant in addressing the conflict. However, Vance's criticism could cause unnecessary tensions between the US and Ukraine, especially since Zelensky maintains the firm stance that Ukraine cannot trust Russia and cannot sit at the negotiation table without clear security guarantees. As the Ukraine-Russia conflict continues, Vance's response could exacerbate divisions among U.S. politicians about whether the U.S. should continue providing aid to Ukraine. If Vance's views continue to be supported by Republican members, we may witness a significant change in U.S. policy towards Ukraine. Reducing aid or demanding that Ukraine make more concrete commitments could strain the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine, especially when Ukraine needs strong support to continue its fight against Russia. An important factor in Vance's response is that he reflected part of the concerns in American society about overextending aid to other countries. Given that the U.S. is facing domestic issues such as economic concerns, border security, and regional foreign policy, maintaining large-scale aid to Ukraine could become a contentious issue. Republican lawmakers like Vance argue that the U.S. needs to prioritize solving domestic issues before continuing to engage in international conflicts. Vance criticized Zelensky not only on the issue of negotiations with Russia, but also for Ukraine's lack of a clear strategy to use aid effectively. Vance emphasized that if Ukraine wanted long-term support from the U.S., they needed to demonstrate that they could take decisive steps toward peace rather than relying on unconditional U.S. aid. This shows that Vance not only demands that Ukraine have a peace negotiation strategy, but also calls for Ukraine to be responsible in utilizing the resources that the U.S. has provided. Despite differing views on Vance's policies, there is no denying that he played an important role in shaping U.S. foreign policy during this meeting. With his strong participation and hardline views, Vance forced President Trump to reconsider decisions regarding continuing aid to Ukraine. The relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine may face significant changes, especially as Vance and others who share his views could influence Trump's foreign policy in the future. In the meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in February 2025, President Trump's response highlighted an important factor in his foreign policy: the balance between national interests and international relationships. Although he was the leader of the meeting and could make important decisions, Trump showed flexibility in his approach to the issue while also allowing Vice President JD Vance to express strong views on Ukraine-related matters. However, Trump still took an active role in directing the meeting and responding to Zelensky's requests. Trump's reactions were not merely compromises or concessions, but reflected deep and strategic thinking, particularly in the current political context of both the U.S. and internationally. From the beginning of the meeting, Trump did not hide his skepticism toward Ukraine, partly due to the strong criticism from Vice President Vance, who had accused President Zelensky of lacking gratitude for the support the U.S. had provided throughout the war with Russia. However, unlike Vance, Trump did not offer public criticism or take an overly harsh stance, but chose a more flexible approach. Although Vance's criticism made the atmosphere of the meeting tense, Trump did not entirely agree with Vance's views, despite both sharing a common vision of the America First policy. While Vance bluntly demanded that Zelensky have a clear plan for negotiations with Russia, Trump appeared more diplomatic, and it seemed that he still wanted to maintain a strong relationship with Ukraine, at least on the diplomatic front. Trump was firm in defending U.S. national interests, but he did not reject cooperation with partner nations like Ukraine if it could advance America's strategic goals in the region. During the meeting, he asserted that the US would not continue to pour all its resources into the Ukraine-Russia conflict unconditionally. But Trump also pointed out that the US could still support Ukraine if there were changes in strategy and if Ukraine could provide clear commitments to engage in peace talks. This signaled that Trump wanted to maintain good relations with Zelensky and Ukraine, but only when there were specific and measurable benefits for the US. Trump's attitude was most evident when he did not fully agree with cutting off aid to Ukraine. While Vice President Vance strongly suggested reducing aid, Trump believed that cutting off aid entirely could lead to the loss of an important ally in Europe, especially as the global situation was becoming more complex. This shows that Trump was not inclined to easily abandon the strategic relationship with Ukraine. Rather, he wanted a change that could be adjusted, not a complete severance. Although Trump may have felt frustrated by Zelensky's failure to come up with an effective peace strategy, he did not fully share Vance's hardline stance on reducing aid to Ukraine. Trump had a different and smarter approach to maintaining US influence on the global stage without deep involvement in conflicts. Trump consistently emphasized in interviews and speeches that the US should focus on its long-term interests rather than getting entangled in conflicts that do not yield clear results. He repeatedly made statements about the need for the US to protect its interests before deciding to intervene in wars, and this helped build his image as a leader who prioritizes the prosperity and security of the American people. In this meeting, Trump demonstrated a certain level of diplomacy when handling the tense situations between Vance and Zelensky. He did not fully side with Vance in his criticisms of Ukraine, but he also did not entirely oppose Vance's views on the need for changes in Ukraine's peace strategy. Instead of continuing to push for unconditional support for Ukraine, Trump tended to prefer setting specific conditions to continue aid. He exhibited a quid pro quo approach in U.S. foreign policy, a policy he had applied throughout his presidency and continued to implement in his meeting with Zelensky. Additionally, Trump could not overlook the concerns within U.S. politics regarding the continued maintenance of aid to Ukraine. Part of these concerns stemmed from strong opposition from Republican members who argued that continuing aid to Ukraine without a clear plan was unsustainable and unreasonable. Trump's attitude in the meeting showed that he wanted to maintain support within the Republican Party while also not wanting to lose support from important international allies like Ukraine. Ultimately, Trump's response in the meeting with Zelensky was a clear example of his foreign policy strategy: flexibility in maintaining international relations while always prioritizing national interests. Trump did not refuse to cooperate with Ukraine, but he also did not hesitate to point out that U.S. support would come with conditions. This attitude, combined with the strong criticism from Vice President Vance, created a tense atmosphere, but also reflected indecision in U.S. foreign policy regarding the Ukraine conflict. Trump's approach showed that in complex international issues, the U.S. would not easily accept unconditional demands from any partner without assurance of long-term benefits for the nation. The outcome of this meeting can be seen as a setback in the U.S.-Ukraine relationship. While both sides declared that they would continue cooperation, the failure to reach any important agreements raised concerns about the future of this relationship. In particular, the cancellation of the joint press conference and the public criticism between the leaders painted an unfavorable picture of cooperation between the two nations moving forward. This meeting also raised questions about the stability and long-term nature of U.S. support for Ukraine. While the Ukrainian government still hopes for strong U.S. backing to continue the fight against Russia, The lack of consensus within the U.S. government, particularly with Vice President Vance's views, could force Ukraine to seek alternative ways to protect its national interests. The consequences of this meeting could lead to a shift in U.S. foreign policy toward Ukraine. If Vance and his allies in the Republican Party have a significant influence in shaping Trump's policies, there may be a reduction in military and financial aid to Ukraine. This would create a political crisis in Ukraine, as the country would face difficulties maintaining its fight against Russia without U.S. support. Moreover, this meeting could also lead to a change in Ukraine's foreign strategy, as Zelensky may face pressure to alter his approach in negotiations with Russia. If Ukraine does not change its strategy, it could face isolation from international partners, especially from the U.S. To avoid negative consequences, several corrective measures could be proposed. Promote peace negotiations. Ukraine needs to proactively seek negotiation opportunities with Russia, not only to minimize human and material losses, but also to ease opposition from supporting nations, including the U.S. Strengthen relations with European countries. If U.S. support is reduced, Ukraine needs to seek stronger backing from European Union countries, particularly those with strategic interests in the region. Renegotiate with U.S. partners. Ukraine should engage in deeper negotiations with the U.S. government to ensure a long-term support strategy, especially in the context of potential political changes in the future. Restore trust. Ukraine needs to prove that it will use aid effectively and has a clear plan for peace, which will help reinforce support from the U.S. and other countries. The meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky is a clear example of the challenges in international relations amid the Ukraine conflict. Vice President JD Vance's harsh criticism of Zelensky sparked significant controversy, fracturing the relationship between the two countries and raising concerns about the future of U.S. support for Ukraine. With potential shifts in U.S. foreign policy, Ukraine must be prepared to face new challenges and find ways to maintain support from international partners.